Welcome to everybody. Good morning or afternoon, as the case may be in your time zone. As Anthony mentioned, I'm Farina Melek. I'm the Vice President of CAG, and on behalf of CAG, I am very pleased to have this webinar today. It's the very first webinar in the new webinar series that CAG has launched. The purpose of these webinars is to highlight the awards that CAG gives out and to hear from the awardees about their research and activities which led them to receiving the award. And while we give out the awards at the annual conference, we don't usually have time to actually hear from the awardees, so this gives us an opportunity to hear from them. So let me introduce today's speaker, Dr. Cosco, who received the CAG Recognition Award for Excellence in Longitudinal Research in honor of Betty Havens, and he received that in 2017. Dr. Cosco is a postdoctoral research fellow in the Gerontology Research Center at Simon Fraser University and the Oxford Institute of Population Aging at the University of Oxford. He holds a CIHR postdoctoral fellowship examining resilience and healthy aging across the life course. Dr. Cosco is a chartered psychologist, trained in applied social research methods and epidemiology. And today he will be speaking to us about taking a longitudinal approach to longitudinal research. In terms of format, as Anthony had mentioned early on, for those of you who were here a little bit before we started, Dr. Cosco will first talk for about 45 minutes. If you do have questions, please type them into the chat box, and I will then look at your questions and will have Teddy respond to them at the end of the talk. So let's turn it over to Teddy.
Thank you for the kind introduction. I'm delighted that people have tuned in to what is the first CAG webinar, and it's actually my first webinar myself. So delighted to be taking on this new format. And today I thought I would take a look at sort of the longitudinal trajectory of my personal experiences in longitudinal research. So to start off with, I thought I'd talk a little bit about the background on me, how I ended up where I am, and hopefully this will provide some insights into some of the theoretical underpinnings that inform my work, the sort of paradigms that I work in, and the perspectives that I come from. And then looking into sort of an introduction to longitudinal studies themselves, some of their characteristics, some of the attributes that they have, and what it's like working with them. I've experienced with a few these longitudinal studies, and this will be some of my first-hand experiences with these, some of the pros and cons and some of the advantages and challenges in doing this type of research. Then I thought I would move into sort of content, more looking at specifically healthy aging and resilience. These are two areas of research that I've focused on primarily during the course of my PhD work and as a postdoc. And I thought I would discuss some of the first-hand experience I have with these content areas within the context of longitudinal studies. Finally, I thought I would talk about where I think longitudinal research is headed, and where I hope it'll go. So to give a brief history on my personal background in gerontology and aging research, it all began when I was about 11 years old. And when my grandmother started exhibiting some fairly significant cognitive deficits, excuse me, and while I obviously didn't have the capacity to articulate at that time, what I was looking at was really a sort of tangible demonstration of the heterogeneity of the aging process. So I had three fairly cognitively intact grandparents and one that was facing absolutely life-altering deficits. So this really piqued my interest in the field of aging and older adults. And fortunately, I was in a program in school where my teachers could recognize this interest and foster that in me. So I was able to skip class to go volunteer at the Clover Bar Lodge when I turned 12. So 12-year-old me would ride my bike during the middle of the day, during school time, to Clover Bar Lodge, and then I would volunteer and then for a couple hours a day, and then head back to school. So this really was my first time I'd really experienced the aging process on a practical level. And through this volunteering experience, it really sort of piqued my interest in the aging process and gave me a firm sort of idea of what the aging process was like, the heterogeneity of it, and it really sort of set the path for the rest of my career in aging research. So fast forwarding a few years, I started my bachelor's in specialization in psychology program. And one of the great aspects of this program was they had the opportunity to do a year-long internship. And I managed to secure a position at Capital Care, which is a long-term and dementia care facility, and doing some of the data collection for the studies that they had running there. And this firsthand experience of data collection really was invaluable because it allowed me to interact with the residents, and I sort of put a face to these sort of data points where I had a really clear idea of what an MMSE of 25, 15, or 5 looks like in a practical setting. So it really, rather than just looking at numbers on a page and then analyzing those data, it gave me a really clear idea and sort of a more practical insight into what the aging process looks like in its many different forms. So I was a research intern at Capital Care for a year, and then I had the opportunity to work with Roger Dixon at the U of A on the Victoria Longitudinal study on aging. So this was the first time I'd sort of dipped my toe in the pool of longitudinal research on a large scale. Some of you may be familiar with the Victoria Longitudinal study. They have a site in Victoria collecting data from older adults, and then in Edmonton, they have the quote control group, which is composed primarily of undergraduate students. So this was my first real experience administering and collecting data on a huge constellation of different instruments, different psychometric instruments, and giving it a really good overview of what sort of metrics are being used to capture different aspects of the aging process, from sort of Stroop tests to MMSEs to timed up and go, so a whole range of different tests. So this would give me a flavor of what sort of data is available within these longitudinal studies. So after I finished my undergraduate degree, I moved to Ireland to take up a study of applied social research at Trinity College Dublin. And this was another great opportunity that I had sought out, in that there was an internship component of the master's program. So I secured a position as a research officer at the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland, working in their population health sciences department. And this was the first time I really got an idea or a flavor of data analysis within a longitudinal study. So I was working with the Survey of Lifestyle and Nutrition, and this again captured a whole battery of different tests, or administered a whole battery of different tests, and had a vast richness of data. And this was sort of my first foray into analyzing these data and getting an idea of how immensely complex these data can be, but also the immense opportunities you have because of this richness of data. Soon after I wrapped up my master's program, I moved to the UK, where I took a PhD studying epidemiology with Professor Carol Brain and Blossom Stefan. And I had actively sought out this group, the Institute of Public Health in Cambridge, because they have two, not just one, but two world-class longitudinal studies, that being the Cognitive Functioning and Aging Study and the Cambridge City Over 75 Cohort Study. And I'll talk about these two in a little bit more detail in a bit, but this was a really great opportunity for me as a PhD student, because I was able to look at two different studies and look at longitudinal methods within two very different studies, looking at similar things, but with different designs and different attributes. So it was really a challenge, but one that was a great learning experience. And so it really provided sort of a new appreciation for the value and the insights that you can gather and gain from these types of studies. So once I finished up my PhD, I stayed in the UK for a while, working with the National Survey of Health and Development, also known as the British 1946 Birth Cohort Study. Again, I'll talk about this one in a little bit later as well. And then finally, just recently, actually, when I at the back end of the CAG conference, I was en route to Vancouver, where I will be taking up a post here at SFU, working specifically with the Canadian longitudinal study on aging. So it's sort of come full circle from working with a number of different studies in different areas, and then finally bringing back to a homegrown study on aging. And we'll talk about this in a little bit, but hopefully this will provide some sort of the background on how I ended up in longitudinal research and how these studies have sort of fostered my development over time to get me where I am now. So you may be asking, what exactly is longitudinal research? And I thought this might be a good place to start. And at a very basic level, longitudinal research is the study of change. And this is obviously important within aging. And in terms of the characteristics of these studies with methodological features, there are three main characteristics for true trajectory-based longitudinal research. The first one being having three or more waves of data. Ideally, you want to have more than 3 waves, like 3 is sort of the bare minimum. Although there's a lot of value in 2-wave data collection or 2-wave studies, but they aren't able to articulate the process of change as well as 3 or more waves. You can't really determine the shape of that change or identify when exactly change occurs, when is a sort of a pre and a post design. So being able to track a longitudinal trajectory and the shape of that trajectory is a really unique attribute of longitudinal studies with 3 or more waves of data. Secondly, you need to have an outcome whose value changes over time. It doesn't make a lot of sense to measure something that is fairly steady across over time. That's not very interesting at all. Ideally, this outcome that changes over time will be measured in a continuous way. If you have a continuous variable, it's a lot easier to be able to manipulate those data and do fancier things with those. And finally, having a sensible metric for time. Generally speaking, this is age. Use age or birth date as a metric for time to calculate it over the course of a study. But it doesn't necessarily have to be age or birth date or whatever you want to use. And I'll touch a little bit on this later and looking at some of the ways that you can manipulate these longitudinal data to do some fancier things. So you may be asking, why would you use longitudinal methods to study aging? And I would suggest that aging itself is a process of change. And as captured by this Benjamin Disraeli quote, I think that really encapsulates sort of the aging process. And specifically, if you want to study aging, you want to be studying change. And longitudinal studies are particularly suited to the study of change. You can look at within individual change, so how people themselves change, and then also inter-individual differences. So looking at how individuals individually change or at a population, how these different things change. So the crux of it is, if you're studying aging, effectively you're studying change, and this is a particularly well-suited means to study aging. So there are a few types of longitudinal studies. The first and most straightforward is a trend study. So this is the type of method that's used for, say, a census. So every few years they administer it across the population, so that the sample is changing somewhat. People are coming in and out of the sample, but it's sort of a cross-section of the whole population, and then you measure that up every few years or in whatever time period you would like. Advancing forward with from this sort of model is looking at a panel study. So this is where you have a discrete sample that you follow over a number of waves or a certain period of time. So you have the same people and they follow them up over a period of time. So moving on from that, and sort of a specific example of a panel study is a cohort study. And this is in the same way, it's having the same sample group and following them up over a period of time. But this is, in this cohort studies, they're joined by a common characteristic, say be a birth date or whatever particular grouping characteristic you'd like to use. So longitudinal cohort studies are a very specific type of study that is very prevalent within the aging literature. So I thought I'd talk about some of the longitudinal studies that have worked with and some of the characteristics of those. So in this slide, this is the cognitive function and aging study, which is based in Cambridge and led by Carol Brain at the Institute of Public Health. And so in the left-hand part of the slide, you can see the study design. And as you may note, it's not necessarily straightforward. These things are fairly complex. But the CFAS study has 6 centers across England and Wales. And in order to get into the study, individuals needed to be 65 years or older. And they were obtained, the list of individuals were obtained from the Family Health Service Authority, and they were randomly selected from these groups to participate in the study. And they stratified the study into age groups, whether they were 65 to 74 or 75 years and older, selecting a population representative sample of approximately 2,500 individuals from each of the different, of the 6 data collection centers across England and Wales. So you can see that at the prevalence screen here was the initial wave in 1991, and they screened around 13,000 individuals, and then individuals that demonstrated some sort of cognitive deficits went into the prevalence assessment, because this was fundamentally a study of dementia. And then looking at the incidence screen, which is where they're trying to capture new cases of dementia. And as you can see by the not necessarily linear progression of the study, depends on a lot of factors, funding, et cetera, et cetera. But they've had started in 91 and have the last data collection wave, I believe, is in 2008. Another study that is based in Cambridge that I had the opportunity to work with is the Cambridge City over 75 cohort. This is a really unique study because it started in 1985 and has been, in order to get into the study, you had to be at least 75 to get in. So if you do the math, you started in 85 and they have 28 years of data collection. So the youngest people in the study here at the survey data collection, survey 10, year 28, the youngest people were 103. So do take note of the sample size here, as this will come into play later. As you might expect, attrition due to dropout or death is a fairly significant concern within longitudinal studies, and something that I think everybody who does longitudinal research wrestles with at some phase or another. So looking at a study closer to home, this is the sampling structure of the Canadian longitudinal study on aging, with the slide graciously provided by the CLSA. And the crux of the CLSA is it's a national long-term study that will follow, I think they have data collection on 51,000 men and women aged 45 to 85, and they will due to be followed up for the next 20 years. And they have an absolute immense array of data being collected. On the website, if you look at the website, they have a list of all the data that are being collected, and it is seriously impressive. And as a small plug, they've just released the first wave of data, and if you're looking to get your hands onto that, go to the website and you can log on there and look at the data access requirements. And of note, if you are a student, master's, PhD, or postdoc, you get a free kick of the can and you get access fees waived. So I highly recommend doing that, as this is going to be, in my opinion, a real powerhouse. It's got a huge sample size, a population representative sampling of the Canadian older adults. So it's going to be really interesting to see what happens over the coming years. So a variation on longitudinal studies is the birth cohort study. And I was fortunate enough to have the opportunity to work with the Medical Research Council's National Survey of Health and Development. And this is a truly unique study in that it is a birth cohort study. They recruited 5,362 singleton births in mainland UK in 1 week of March of 1946. So it's a nationally representative sample, and it's also the largest or the longest running continually studied birth cohort in the world. And I think this is a truly unique study in that the foresight was just amazing. You think about 1946, post-war Britain, and this is pre-NHS. They had no National Health Service, and James Douglas put together this study, had a population representative sample of 5,300 babies that were joined into the study. And they follow them up for now 71 years over more than 20 waves of data collection. And I think one of the real strengths of the study has been the retention. And they've managed to keep participants actively engaged in the study, and they have been really active components of and going out and participating in the study, filling out the surveys every year or every few years. And I think that's in a large part due to the leadership by the study directors, notably Michael Wadsworth and Diana Koo, who do things like this. Every study participant gets a birthday card every year, which is a nice little touch. And so there's sort of like a sense of community. And I was fortunate enough to be in London working with the 46 cohort in 2016, when it was the 70th birthday of all the study participants. So we sent out in the middle of the screen here, this was the birthday card we sent out to all the study participants. And then we also had a big birthday party, one in London and one in Manchester, that were very well attended. There were more than 500 people, or study participants, that came to each study, or each birthday party rather. And I think, people talk about the heterogeneity of the aging process, and that's really an interesting component of studying aging. But I think this photo in the right bottom of your slide here, really encapsulate that, because everybody in this photo is exactly the same age. So this photo is all of the study participants in London. They came out to the birthday party, and we took this photo. And I thought it was a really fantastic event in that we got to firsthand see everybody, a group of people that are the exact same age, and look at how the huge range of functional capacities and just interacting with people. Each of the different study streams did a little presentation, and we interacted with the study participants and could show them, what we had found, and I thought was a really fantastic process. So the birth cohort studies may seem like sort of the holy grail, but I thought I would include this just to as a side note, in that the birth cohort studies, there are 5 of them in the UK, and really fantastic resources. Have fantastic implications for longitudinal resource. Studying people from 0 to whatever age is fantastic, but it's not as easily done as one might think. So they tried to do a study, birth cohort study in the US, the National Children's Studies. It's commissioned in 2000, and they're trying to look at 100,000 children from birth age 21. And the NIH spent $1.2 billion on the effort. And in 2014, they had to stop the study. They had to cancel the whole study, which is a real tragedy, because this would have been a fantastic resource. Not to be outdone, the UK then had their LIFE study, which was a new birth cohort study, and they were attempting to recruit 80,000 individuals to take part in this birth cohort study. And the Economic and Social Research Council, Medical Research Council had put 38 some million pounds into the study to fund it out to 2019. But unfortunately, they experienced the exact same thing. They could not recruit individuals on the scale that had been done previously, and they ended up having to cancel the study, which was a real tragedy as well. So I thought I'd move on to onto more of a content area. This is looking at healthy or successful aging, and in this slide here, it looks at the number of published articles per year that look at healthy or successful aging. And as you can see, there's been exponential growth in the number of individuals that are publishing on this topic. So clearly, it's a hot button topic. Clearly, people are very interested in it. One of the key things about longitudinal studies is having a firm operational definition structure. And one of the things that I found in my PhD that was a little bit unfortunate when I tried to look at successful aging was that this isn't exactly as easy as one might think it would be. And the heterogeneity of the literature is absolutely profound. So as a somewhat naive PhD student, I thought it'd be a great idea to systematically review successful aging definitions. So firstly, I wanted to look at what are researchers saying. So how do researchers operationally define successful aging? So we looked at screened around 7,300 articles, and there were found 103 studies, and there were 105 unique operational definitions that researchers had used to describe successful aging. So if you're interested, you can take a look at this paper here. Complementing the research-driven definitions, I wanted to look at what are older adults themselves saying. So how do older adults, when asked, how do you define successful aging, what are their thoughts on this construct? So we did a sort of the second prong of this systematic review, looking at qualitative studies. So looking at studies that had conducted interviews with older adults, asking them about their thoughts on what successful aging is. And then the really interesting part, to my mind, was being able to compare and contrast those. And I think it's really important when you have a longitudinal study, you want to have a firm operational definition structure, so you know that you're measuring the same thing over and over and over, so you can track it reasonably. But also, I think having the lay-informed perspective is really important. So if you're trying to measure something that isn't actually that important to older adults, you're really not maximizing the value that you could be adding by by whatever stream of research you're conducting. So having that informing process, I think, is really important. So looking at the conceptualization of successful aging, in this radar diagram here, it's got at the outskirts of each of these spokes is a different successful aging domain. And then as you go radiate out from the center spoke to these outmost points, it looks at the percentage of the studies that captured each of these different domains. So when you look at the quantitative studies, so these are researcher-driven perspectives, you can see that there's a really strong focus on more physiological components, so cognitive functioning and disability, as well as physical functioning and disability. But when you contrast that to the qualitative studies, so these are what older adults are saying, there's a huge focus on more of these psychosocial components. So looking at personal resources and engagement, like almost all of the studies reported participants saying that personal resources and engagement were components of successful aging. So in my mind, I thought, okay, so now I've identified the researchers' perspectives and as well as the older adults' perspectives, so I can take the most important components as identified by these reviews, and then I can pull them together and then map it into a longitudinal study. And this seemed like a really straightforward process, but when I actually went to map it in the study, traditionally successful aging definitions have been you meet the highest functioning criteria and you're successful aging, or you don't. So I had very ambitiously thought I would map it into all of the combined screening and assessment studies, so looking at 7 waves. Thought that would be fairly straightforward. So when I modeled it in using a binary model, so saying if you meet all of the criteria as I identified in the review, if you're top level functioning in all of these components, you're defined as successfully aging. So when I mapped that across the different waves, this is what I ended up with. So the brown bars, so in the y-axis you have the percentage of participants that met the binary criteria. And the brown bars, those are the percentage of individuals that met the psychosocial components criteria, so personal resources, engagement. The black is the physiological components, so physical functioning, cognitive functioning. But the really interesting bit and the frustrating bit was that this red bar captured people who met all of the criteria. So using this biopsychosocial model, less than 1% in the first wave met the criteria, and less than 1% in the second and third waves, and by the fourth wave, nobody met this criteria. So this is, well, hugely frustrating for one, but also it really highlights the how impractical this model is, looking at it in a binary way. So I wrote this up in the aptly titled Unsuccessful Binary Modeling of Successful Aging, and trying to highlight the fact that these are really unrealistic models if you're trying to categorize individuals as successful aging or not. And what's more is when you look at other studies that have done this using a binary model. So in the y-axis here, these are all of the studies that were captured in the researcher-driven perspective review. These are the studies that had provided an operational definition for successful aging, and in the x-axis are the percentage of the study participants who met those criteria. And when you look at the distribution of these, it's a little bit ridiculous, because you have anything from less than 1% of individuals meeting the criteria to more than 90%. And so there's a huge heterogeneity in how people are conceptualizing this and how they're establishing a binary threshold for whether you are or you are not successfully aging. What's more is, within these binary conceptualizations, you have this sort of arbitrary range of functioning for, quote, successful aging. And if you dip below that, you're no longer in a successful aging category. You're not grouped as successfully aging. And this is particularly relevant and for looking at the end of life, because invariably individuals experience some sort of functional decline of some description as they decline, as they approach death. And there's really no way to articulate this within this successful aging paradigm. And I wrote about this in the Canadian Medical Association Journal, looking at how the models of aging that we're using for successful aging are really not feasible for end of life. And they're not providing the granularity to be able to articulate this. So clearly we need to do something. So in trying to articulate this further, have a greater level of granularity in articulating this, I took a page out of the Frailty Index book, and particularly great work by Ken Rockwood, Arnold Magnitsky, and Sam Searle. And they put out this paper looking at basically a protocol for developing a frailty index. And I turned that around and I tried to use that in more of the components that I was looking at within the items identified in the systematic reviews. So these are, as you can see, these are more, as you might guess, more positive ones. So basically, in the process of the indexes, you take an ordinal item and then you assign the value ranked from 0 to 100. So it's got 3 items, go 150, 0. 4 items, 100, 67, 33, 0. So I use this procedure to map it into the woefully unoriginally named successful aging index. And as you can see in the left-hand most column of the table on the right-hand side of the slide, those are the components, the items are the ones that were identified within the systematic reviews that I did, looking at the older adults and the researcher-driven perspectives. So I implemented this procedure, and basically what it does is it gives you a continuous measure, which is fantastic. So rather than having that woefully useless binary modeling, you get these wonderful box plots. So, and they are roughly normally distributed, a few outliers here and there. But this gives you a continuous measure, and it allowed me to implement this over time in a number of different waves in a way that actually was much more meaningful than a binary model. So now that I had wrestled with that issue, I was like, okay, perfect, go ahead, and I can actually implement these into the study, into the CFAS study. One issue that I hadn't thought about is in modeling those, clearly there's issues with attrition. Any longitudinal study will have this, particularly aging studies, and the sample size decreases significantly over time. So you have, in the first combined screening assessment, you got 1,600 people, and by C12 you have just under 200. And so this is something to bear in mind, because that really can be problematic when you're modeling these things. So I opted to just use these 3 waves here to model the successful aging index and to look at their scores over time. So when you do this, what you end up with is this spaghetti plot. So these are, each line there is an individual's trajectory over time through those 3 waves of data collection, looking at the successful aging index score. But this isn't exactly useful. It doesn't really it can't really make a lot of sense of this. So you need to use some sort of modeling techniques to extract meaning from these. So this is where growth mixture modeling comes into place. And thanks to some fantastic help from my statistics mentors in Cambridge, that I was actually able to learn these methods. And I will say it looks incredibly complex, But if you have this book by Bullen and Kern, it is a fantastic resource, and it really puts it into a format that's understandable and easily digestible. But the crux of growth mixer modeling is it's able to identify homogeneous subpopulations within a larger heterogeneous population. So you're able to tease out different groups of individuals and different trajectories of individuals. One of the issues with this is if the models have difficulty converging if there's less than 10% of the original sample, which is why sometimes you have to limit how many ways you're able to use, which is why I was only able to use 3 in this example. But the crux of it is you have your latent growth factor here, you have slope and intercept, and you look at how your observed variables with their residual variance here, how they influence the trajectories in these different groups, and there's also room to include covariates here. So as I say, look at this book, fantastic resource. So I was able to model this, to map that out in the 3 different ways in that spaghetti plot that you saw. And the beauty of growth mixer modeling is that you take this fairly useless spaghetti plot and you're able to tease out different categories or different trajectories, classify people into groups that fit different trajectories. And this is dynamite because then you have individuals classified in each of these different trajectories, and you can look at the intercept and the slope over time. And what's more is now you can compare individuals that belong to different groups. What are the characteristics that define whether or not individuals will be in either of these groups? And this is a brief snapshot from the paper that is actually in the most recent edition of the Canadian Journal on Aging, looking at successful aging trajectories and education. And the take-home message is that when you compare the highest functioning versus the lowest functioning, or the highest functioning versus the moderately functioning trajectories, individuals with higher levels of education were significantly more likely to be in the higher functioning trajectory. So it allows you to compare the groups and look at different attributes that are associated with each of these different groups. So as I mentioned, one of the modeling issues in successful aging as a binary model is that you can't articulate this end-of-life trajectory. And that was something I was really interested at looking at. How do people age well right up until death? So now that I'd used the CFAST study, I want to use the CC75C study, which is a really interesting one in that, as I say, the last wave of data collection, the youngest individuals are 103. So the issue that arises with that is that in the last wave of data collection, there are 3 people. This doesn't do wonders for statistical power. So I had to come up with a way that I could use a reasonable metric for time to be able to capture a reasonable sample size. Because as I mentioned previously, growth mixer modeling has a really difficult time converging when there's less than 10% of the original sample. So what I did was, instead of looking at using age as the time metric, I used time to death as the time metric. So having the last wave before death would be baseline, and then second last wave before death, wave 1, et cetera, et cetera. And this way we had, because virtually everybody in the study has already died, so by using age to death, or time to death rather, as a time metric, you can look at this in a unique way. So one of the requirements for longitudinal studies is a reasonable metric for time. Age doesn't necessarily have to be that one. You can use, as in this case, time to death as the metric. So when I applied growth mixer modeling to CC75C, we could look at, so we have in the rightmost portion of the slide, this is death here, and then you can look at individuals into trajectories towards death and how people, again, whether or not people are, quote, aging well towards death, which I think is a really interesting thing. It sort of puts the whole successful aging paradigm, binary models, in a different light. So this was more of a conceptual piece, and again, you can read about this in the Canadian Journal on Aging to look at some of that. The next area of interest that I have is in looking at resilience. And previously I'd done a systematic review of operational definitions of resilience, and we found that there are basically 2 components that you need. You need to have some form of adversity, then you need to have some sort of positive response to that adversity, And if you have individuals that respond more positively than you would expect given the level of adversity they experience, then you have resilience. So this is sort of the conceptual framework, and I wanted to look at people who are doing better than would be expected. And trying to merge that with my healthy aging research, we'd recently done some conceptual work on trying to see how these fit together. So if you look at functioning in the y-axis here, and then adversity in the x-axis, when you look at how the functional levels you would expect given the level of adversity experienced, you would expect people that have greater levels of adversity, so out at this end, would have lower levels of functioning. So this dotted line represents, in a hypothetical example, the relationship between expected level of functioning given the level of adversity experienced. In traditional healthy aging models, as you discussed, generally speaking, you want to have a high level of functioning regardless of what happens. So this green band sort of captures individuals that would be classified by traditional models as, quote, healthily aging or successful aging, as it were. Conversely, when you look at resilience being conceptualized as individuals that have greater levels of functioning than would be expected given their level of adversity, it covers a much greater range of functional abilities. So individuals, even that are experiencing huge levels of adversity out here, even if they would have functioning that's lower than what would be classified as healthy aging, they're still considered to be resilient because they have a better than expected outcome than would be expected for their level of adversity. And this has been a tricky thing to operationalize. And as I mentioned previously, having a firm operational definition of the construct you're measuring is really important in longitudinal studies because you want to measure these things consistently. So there are a number of different ways to operationalize resilience in a cross-sectional way. Ann Maston has really advocated for this categorical method, saying, so if you face the highest level of adversity, you're in the top tertile of adversity, but you also have the most positive response, then you're resilient. So this is more of a definition-driven method. Cross-sectionally, there's a data-driven method that I've used previously with mixed success, I would say. It's looking at, you plot linearly regress an adaptation on an adversity. So you get this linear regression line here. So anybody that has a positive residual value or is above the regression line would suggest that they have greater levels of adaptation than would be expected given their level of adversity. So basically you're looking at the difference between the observed outcome and the expected outcome. And in this way, you can quantify whether individuals are resilient or in the case that they're below the regression line, they are vulnerable. So this is a great way to quantify this in a continuous, normally distributed way. But within a longitudinal context, it's more in the same vein as the gross metric modeling that I've used previously in the successful aging index and whatnot, where you have a group, a sample of participants that have some inherent adversity, say multi-morbidity burden or functional limitations, etc. And then you track their functioning over time, and then you can look at individuals that have the best functioning or the most resilient functional trajectory. So this is one way that you can operationalize this. You do, again, need at least 3 waves of data collection, a reasonable metric for time, etc., etc. An alternative method to looking at longitudinal, more of a longitudinal perspective, but not traditional longitudinal trajectory modeling, is looking at more mediation analysis. So where you look at the relationship between some sort of adversity and some sort of outcome, and looking at mediators or different variables that might exist along the causal pathway between the adversity to the outcome. And I've recently been looking at this, specifically looking at early childhood adversity within the 1946 birth cohort. So we have prospective data on individuals having adversity as children, and then we can look at the relationship between adversities experienced from 0 to 16, and then look at their later life mental health outcomes at age 63, 68, and 69. And then we can look at So are there some like resilience fostering resources that exist along this causal pathway that are influencing this? So is some of the variance in the relationship between early childhood diversity and mental health somehow influenced by these resources? And in short, we found that there is some difference. There are some pathways that exist. So we looked at physical activity, socioeconomic status, and different socioeconomic indicators, and this relationship was not mediated via the relationship between psychosocial adversity and mental distress was not mediated via physical activity and socioeconomic resources, but the relationship was mediated by social support and by neighborhood cohesion. So this suggests that individuals that have greater levels of social support and greater levels of neighborhood cohesion might be able to offset some of these early life cycle social adversities as they relate to mental distress in later life. So this is a different method, so different attributes, but another longitudinal way to look at relationships within the aging process. So to sum up, I think fundamentally aging is a study of change. And I think longitudinal methods are particularly well suited to being able to look at this change. And the longitudinal cohort studies that follow the same people over the time, such as some of the studies that I had spoken about briefly, are well suited to looking at some of these changes. And there are a variety of different methodological approaches that you can use within these longitudinal cohort studies, or longitudinal birth cohort studies for that matter, that you can use to really tap into the richness of these data and make use of these valuable resources. And within that, the theories that I'm interested in specifically are healthy aging and resilient are distinct but related constructs that sort of nest well within each other. And within the context of the studies, using these different methodological approaches and with these areas of interest of mine, these research areas, they really sort of dovetail nicely together, and you're able to extract a lot of value from the studies within these contexts. So finally, in terms of future directions, I think that with longer studies, clearly that's better. You know, you have richer data, you're allowed to look at the shape of the trajectories over time. This is really valuable information. I do think that looking at more sophisticated data collection methods is going to be important. You know, perhaps like tech-driven ones, harnessing the power of smartphones, smart devices is going to be increasingly important. But also, I think the barrier to entry for analysis methods is being lowered. You know, programs are much more user-friendly than they were. And I think that people will be able to use more advanced methods as these techniques progress. Again, I think that they will move away from traditional paper and pen methods into more tech-driven things, tech-driven data collection methods using active and passive data collection. But I think that the most importantly, and what I really hope to see is that there are more data scientists. There's tons and tons of data out there, and I think what we really need to do is utilize those data. You know, I think that we have these resources that are largely untapped, particularly, and this is a shameless plug, the CLSA just released their first wave of data collection, and it is a largely untapped resource that's going to be continuing for the next several decades. So I would highly recommend to go out there and fill out a data access request if you have an interest in setting up your longitudinal profile with the CLSA. So I'd just like to say thanks for tuning in this morning, or afternoon or evening as it were. And but I'd mostly like to thank the study participants. I wouldn't have a job if it weren't for the people that have dedicated their time and effort to these studies over time and have participated in the ones that I've talked about. But also thanks to study coordinators in Cambridge, London, and Oxford. And if you'd like to get in contact with me, please do drop me a line. Here are a couple of my email addresses. The bulk of the papers that I've listed are on my ResearchGate profile. And do be sure to follow me on Twitter. I could use more followers, and sometimes my posts are even interesting. And here's a list of references, and I would be happy to take any questions you might have.
Thank you very much, Teddy, for that excellent talk. I'm glad you gave your contact information. Maybe you could just flip back to that for a moment. We had a couple of questions or comments around whether the PowerPoint presentation is available. So I would suggest to just contact Teddy directly. Is that okay with you? I guess I should have asked you first.
Yeah, that's no problem. No problem at all.
All right. And if there's anything specific that you would like to discuss with him, how about I would suggest you just contact Teddy directly for that. Let me just ask you a question, just because of your extensive experience with working with longitudinal data. What are some of the key challenges in working with longitudinal data?
That's a good question. I think that anybody who's done research with secondary data sets knows that you are confined by what's there. So if you have in your mind a hypothesis that's looking at A, B, C, and D, and you look at the data and you have A, B, and C, but no D, you're gonna have to fundamentally reframe your question. And so I think sort of wrestling with what's feasible within the data, and oftentimes the questions that you would have hoped they would have asked aren't asked, and you have to be smart about the way you frame up your questions. And within that, the sort of missing questions, there's also missing data is a very prominent issue that individuals will face. And there are lots of good methods for accommodating missing data, particularly within growth mix modeling, which generally uses full information maximum likelihood estimation, which is a great method of accommodating missing data. So the two biggest challenges would be the questions not being there and data not being there when you hope they would be.
Yeah, thanks for that. Just as another question, just because you have had a very interesting trajectory, you starting in a long-term care facility at age 12, I think that's very unique. Just what would be your recommendations to get young people involved in aging and aging issues and interested in aging issues? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think that, the aging population is a growth market. I think that, the population is experiencing unprecedented growth in the aging population. I think that whether people like it or not, they're going to be experiencing a lot more of the implications of the aging population, for better or for worse. And I think that having firsthand experience with older adults is really, it's hard not to be interested in it, I guess, in my very biased opinion. But spending time with your grandparents or spending time volunteering at a care facility, I think it's hard not to want to get involved. And from my perspective, at an early age, having that firsthand experience and seeing the vast variety of the ways that people age and thinking that you might be able to have a positive impact on that was really what got me into the field. And that has, to this day, I'm incredibly thankful that I had that firsthand experience, as a kid, volunteering, and then being able to do data collection in the first instance really gave me a good idea of, the immense variety of aging processes and how you might be able to impact that positively.
Okay, well, I would like to formally, officially, on behalf of CAG, thank Dr. Cosco for this, for doing this webinar, especially because it was our very first webinar. Everybody, please stay tuned for more webinars. Hopefully, we'll have one more this fairly soon, in the next couple of months or so. You will hear that, or we'll see it announced through the CAG mailings. Also, let me remind you that the call for abstracts is now open, so please watch for that and please submit your abstracts, and I hope to see everybody there. Have a wonderful day, and I will close the webinar now.